On the morning of February 28, 2005, a 64-year-old man named Michael Lefkow limped down the stairs inside of his home in Chicago, Illinois. He'd injured his Achilles tendon playing tennis the week before, so now he had a cast in his leg, and he had to get around on crutches. When Michael got into the kitchen, he saw his wife Joan making breakfast for the whole household, which included Michael, their teenage daughter Meg, and Joan's elderly mother Donna, who had been living with them for the past 4 or 5 months. Michael said good morning to his wife, and then he hobbled his way through the kitchen over to the dining room where Meg was finishing up her eggs. And they chatted for a few minutes, and then the school bus honked outside, and Meg grabbed her backpack and raced past her dad on her way out the front door. A few moments later, Joan walked into the dining room as well with a plate of food for Michael and a cup of orange juice. And Michael thanked her, and then he asked her, "What's on the docket for you today?" And he meant that literally, because Joan was a federal judge. And, she had like a very heavy burden on her shoulders. She was routinely thrust into these cases where it was her job to make these just really difficult decisions. Decisions that, sometimes were sort of in that gray area between, is this the right moral decision or is this the right legal decision? And it was really her job to err on the side of legal. And the reality is she was a great judge, but sometimes her decisions would, put her in danger. This was, again, a very heavy burden, and it was something that Michael, being an attorney himself, definitely understood. He knew what it meant to be a judge. But, on this particular day, when Michael asked her what she was up to in court, it just sounded an awful lot like today was going to be very typical, sort of a run-of-the-mill day for her. Nothing too crazy, no big decisions looming. And so pretty soon, the two of them were just having their breakfast, and it was just a very relaxed morning. And at some point, Michael told Joan that because of his injury, he actually was not going into the office today. He was going to be working from home. And so pretty soon, they wrapped up their breakfast, they cleaned up, and then before long, Joan was ready to go. She grabbed her stuff, and she said goodbye to her husband, and then out the door she went, hopped in her car, and drove off to court. About half an hour later, around 9 a.m., Michael was getting ready to start his day at the house when he saw Joan's mother, Donna, coming down the stairs. Donna was 89 years old and needed 2 canes just to walk, and she'd been hospitalized for sepsis the previous year. So, since Joan and Michael had extra space in their home, they had offered to let her stay with them so she wouldn't be alone and they could help her if they needed to. And so Michael, despite being hurt himself, he immediately got up and hobbled over and helped Donna get down the last few steps, and then he led her back over to the dining room and helped her sit in her favorite chair. And then after she was situated and she said that she didn't need anything else, Michael thought, okay, now I'm going to start my day. And so he gathered up his things and he headed downstairs into the basement where his home office was. When Michael reached the bottom of the basement steps, he hobbled his way down this hallway that led to a door. He opened the door up, and inside was his home office. In he went, and he sat down at his desk, and there was already some files on the desk that he needed to sift through, and so he picked them up and began looking through the files, figuring out where he was going to start for the day. And as he was sitting there, he thought he heard something in the closet, the utility closet that was in the home office that he was in, and the door to the utility closet was shut. And he just sat there and he listened, and again, he heard what sounded like rustling or something inside of this closet. And so he thought, maybe it's the furnace that's, working extra hard right now. Maybe it's making some weird sounds or something. But, for whatever reason, he's thinking there's something happening in this closet. I want to see what it is. And so he gets up and he hobbles his way over to the closet. And then right as he's hearing more rustling inside, he turns the doorknob and he opens up this closet. At 5 p.m. that night, Michael's wife, Joan, walked through the parking garage at the federal courthouse and got into her car. She was feeling a bit unsettled because she had called Michael a couple of times that afternoon, but there had been no answer. And this was just really unlike him. In fact, this was so unusual that Joan had actually gotten in touch with her daughter, Meg, after the school day ended and asked her, have you been in touch with Dad? And Meg said that she hadn't. But she had gone home after school and she had grabbed some workout clothes in the house before leaving again. And she said when she was in the house, she had not seen her dad or, Joan's mom, so her grandmother, Donna. She said the house was quiet and I just assumed that Dad and Grandma were asleep upstairs or something. It took Joan about half an hour to drive home. And when she pulled into the driveway around 5:30 that night, it was getting dark. And so she pulls into her driveway, she gets out, she's still pretty anxious because she just hasn't heard from Michael or her mom at this point, and she goes up to the front door, she unlocks it, she steps inside, and right away she calls out for Michael. But there's no answer. She calls out for her mom. There's no answer. And so she walks around the first floor. Again, no sign of any issues here. Her husband and her mom are not around. She eventually makes her way upstairs, hoping to find them asleep in their beds, but she gets up there and she checks the bedrooms and all the rooms upstairs, and there's no one up there. And so the only place left to look in the house was the basement. But at this hour, it just made no sense that Michael or her mom would be in the basement. And so eventually, even though she felt really uneasy, she went back to the first floor. She went to the doorway that led down to the stairs into the basement, and she took a deep breath. She turned on the lights inside of the stairwell down to the basement, and she called out for Michael and her mom, but still no answer. And then down the stairs she went. And when she got to the base of the stairs, she looked down that hallway that led to Michael's office. And she saw, first, there was nothing. She didn't see anything. But on the floor, right outside of Michael's office, she saw what looked like blood on the ground. And so at this point, she panicked. She ran down the hallway. She's screaming for Michael. She grabs the door handle. She opens it up. And it's like everything she saw in there was so shocking. It was like her brain couldn't process it. And she just shut the door right away. Like she couldn't handle what she had just seen. And then a moment later, she had bolted back upstairs and called 911. In the late evening of February 28, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacombe of the Chicago FBI office ducked under the crime scene tape around the Lefkow family's home. So about 30 minutes earlier, the 911 call had come out of this home from Joan about what appeared to be a murder at this address. And since the caller, Joan, had identified herself as a federal judge, the Chicago police had immediately called the FBI to take part in this investigation. And so now, Special Agent Seacombe flashed his badge to one of the uniformed officers who was standing outside right near the edge of the crime scene tape, and he asked them, "Where is Judge Joan Lefkow?" And the officer said that Judge Joan, along with her daughters, so not just Meg, her teenage daughter, but also Joan's 3 adult daughters who no longer lived at home, they had all been taken together to a safe house by the U.S. Marshals. And so Seacombe, after hearing this, stepped inside the house, and he found a whole bunch of forensic teams already hard at work sweeping every room for evidence. And as he walked through the living room and the kitchen on the main floor, he didn't see any signs of blood or a struggle of any kind. And he also saw that, TV and other expensive-looking electronics were still in place. And so he didn't think this was a robbery gone wrong. Seacombe eventually found his way to the stairs that led down into the basement, and so down he went, and he found there were a few officers and a crime scene photographer that were down there gathered around a door that was at the end of the hallway. And so Seacombe made his way down the hallway, he pushed past the group of people, and there, inside of this home office, he saw 2 dead bodies. There was a man who was lying face down, and then right next to him was also an elderly woman who was lying face up, and there was just a big pool of blood underneath both of them. Seacombe immediately noticed that both the victims had fairly obvious gunshot wounds to their heads. And then when he knelt down to get a better look, he also found shell casings scattered around on the floor. So he figured that very likely these 2 clearly have been shot, but more specifically, they've been shot and killed in this room. On the other side of this office, Seacombe saw there was a closet and its doors were open, and it appeared to be a utility closet. And so Seacombe, he walked over and he stepped inside, and inside of it was this big furnace, and then next to it on the ground, he found there was a 12-pack of beer bottles, except one of the bottles was missing. And so Seacombe looked around inside the closet, he didn't see the 12th bottle, and then he turned around and looked back into the office. And as he's looking back into the office, he notices there's this window high up inside of the office. And it actually was out to the ground floor, because this is a basement, right? This is a window that leads to the first floor of the house, if you will. And there's like a cutout inside of the office, like a windowsill, almost like a ledge that is part of this window, right? So you could actually place things on this windowsill if you wanted to. And he looked up into this window and he saw there was a single beer bottle sitting on that windowsill, on that ledge. And also he saw the window itself was shattered. And so right away, Seacombe's thinking like, okay, did the killer leave behind this beer? And if so, why? Like, is this a message? Are they leaving the bottle here on purpose for us to find it? Or is this a mistake? And so Seacombe, he called for a forensics officer to come over and bag this additional bottle, the 12th bottle, and swab it for DNA and fingerprints in case, this was left by the killer. And so the forensics officer, he placed this bottle inside of a plastic bag, And then he asked Seacom to leave the office and head upstairs for a minute so that he and his team could spray the entire basement with a chemical called leucocrystal violet, which can illuminate traces of blood that are not necessarily visible to the naked eye. And so as Seacom left the office and began making his way upstairs, he began thinking about what he had just learned. So you have a broken window leading into the home office where it appears the shooting took place. And the fact that, the window was broken does suggest that's how the killer or killers got in. And if that's the case, it likely means the killer or killers did not know the victims personally. They didn't have a key to the house, for example, or they weren't going to be let in if they showed up at the front door. But then you have this weird beer bottle thing. Like if the killer left behind beer in that utility closet and this extra beer bottle up on the ledge of the window, that feels really sloppy. And so that's sort of at odds with the idea that this was like an intentional, outsider coming to do this hit. And then he's also thinking the elephant in the room here is that Joan, Judge Joan Lefkow, this is her husband and her mother. Was that intentional? Were they trying to sort of indirectly hurt Judge Joan? Or was Judge Joan the target? Or was this coincidence? An hour later, while forensics teams were still searching the crime scene, Seacom went out to canvass the neighborhood. The chemical spray that the forensics team had sprayed in the basement after Seacom had left had in fact revealed additional traces of blood all over the basement hallway. So it looked like at least one of the victims had actually been shot in the hallway and then moved into the office. And then the killer apparently had cleaned the hallway afterwards, but obviously this chemical had still revealed the blood traces. And so Seacom thought to himself that if the killer or killers stuck around to clean up after themselves, it suggests that they went into this home with the intention of committing murder. It was just a matter of why. Was it Joan the target? Was it her loved ones? Why did that happen? Who would want to harm the Lefkows? And so Seacom went down the street, knocking on doors and speaking to various neighbors, trying to get a feel for, what the Lefkows were like. But, after speaking to many people on the block who tried to be very helpful, Seacom really hadn't learned much of anything. No one really had all that much to say. But eventually, Seacom found his way to a church that was in the neighborhood, and he knocked on the door. And a moment later, the pastor opened the door, and Seacom explained that, unfortunately, a double murder had taken place down the block, and they were here investigating. And have you seen or heard anything unusual in the past, several hours? And the pastor at first is just totally taken aback by what he's been told. He can't believe it. But then he's like, you know what? Actually, yeah, something strange did happen earlier today. The pastor said he had seen this red car just loitering nearby that had two men inside of it. And they were apparently smoking and drinking cans of what appeared to be Coca-Cola. But they just sort of didn't fit in with the neighborhood. The pastor didn't know who they were. And it just seems sort of odd that they were here. And so just considering what he's been told about this double murder, he basically said, you might want to look into who those guys were. And so Seacom asked the pastor if he'd gotten a good enough look at these two men to maybe be able to help their sketch artist come up with a composite sketch. And the pastor said, yeah, I think so. And so Seacom's like, okay, great, we're going to do that. But also, can you specifically point out where this car was, outside, so I can go look at the area? And the pastor, he pointed across the street and he said, right over there. And so Seacom, he looks where the pastor is pointing, and sure enough, he could see on the ground there were all these cigarette butts and clearly an empty Coke can. And so Seacom called over a forensics team, and they scooped the stuff up and they sent it off to be tested. Later that same night, Seacom sat down at a table at the safe house where Joan and her daughters were all staying. And Joan, she walked over and set a glass of water in front of him, and then she sat down across from him. And Seacom thought Joan seemed surprisingly calm and composed, considering her husband and her mother have just been brutally murdered. But he also could sense that underneath the surface of Joan's sort of calm affect, she seemed furious. And so Seacom and Joan, they spoke a little bit about, this great tragedy and how awful this was. However, pretty quickly, Seacom just sort of got into asking pointed questions of Joan, and Joan answered them. Seacom asked Joan about the 12-pack of beer that was in the utility closet in the basement, and she told him it was left over from a party that they had thrown earlier that same week. And she said she was the one who actually put those beers in the closet, and when she did, she said they were all unopened. And this was great news for Seacom and the investigation, because that meant that the beer up on that windowsill in the basement almost certainly was handled by the killer or killers. But still, the idea of somebody breaking into this house and stumbling across some beer in the closet and stopping to actually have a drink right in the middle of committing a double murder and then leaving the beer bottle behind, it just felt like a really weird decision to make. And so Seacom wondered if maybe there was something at play here that literally prevented the killer from thinking clearly in the moment, like mental illness or maybe drug use. So at this point, Seacom had already come to the conclusion that very likely Donna, Joan's elderly mother, was not the intended target. She's 89, she doesn't have any known enemies, she's not hurting anyone, like she's not a target here. But perhaps Michael, Joan's husband, could have been the target. After all, at one point he had actually run for Cook County judge a few years ago, and even though he had lost, entering politics was a surefire way to make enemies, so it was possible he could have been the target and Donna was collateral damage, but most likely of all still was that Joan was the one being targeted. Seacom knew that as a federal judge, there could be literally hundreds of people holding very serious grudges against her. And so Seacom told Joan that back at the command post, there was a team of detectives going through her entire docket and making a list of everyone who might have had a ruling that they were not happy with in the past few years. But maybe to help speed things along, he asked Joan if she could think of anybody off the top of her head who might have been responsible for this. And Joan, sort of without hesitation, said, yeah. In fact, there were 3 cases that came to mind. The first case was about a guy named Sean Peters, who was the leader of a local gang, and Joan had given him a very lengthy prison sentence, and so she said any of his fellow gang members, in theory, could have come after her in retaliation. The second case she brought up was about this armed robber whose name was Richard Young, and she said he just really scared her in the courtroom. Like he himself was just a very intimidating and sort of threatening person, and so he seemed capable of doing something like this. And she said the third case was about Matthew Hale. And before she even got into the explanation, Seacom recognized the name. Because at the time, Hale was one of the most notorious white supremacists in all of Illinois. 6 years earlier, one of his followers had committed this horrible shooting spree that left 2 people dead and 9 others injured. Joan said that Hale had actually targeted her a couple of years ago in the wake of this trademark dispute. A church in Oregon with the same name as Hale's group had sued them, and Joan had actually enforced a ruling that forced Hale to change his group's name. Joan said that just the year before, Hale had actually been convicted of plotting to kill her over this issue. Joan said he was still in prison for those charges, so Seacom realized he could not have pulled the trigger himself, but clearly he had many followers who were willing to do things like this for him. The next day, so March 1st, Seacom sat down from notorious white supremacist Matthew Hale in a visiting room at the prison in Chicago where he was incarcerated. Hale was this very clean-cut, very stern-looking man in his mid-30s, and he didn't seem remotely rattled to be sitting across from an FBI agent who basically was insinuating that Hale was a potential suspect in a double homicide. And so Seacom told Hale about how Joan Lefkow's husband and her elderly mother had been brutally murdered inside of her home. And in response, Hale just laughed. He said that he and his followers had nothing to do with those murders. But, this was more or less what Seacom had expected Hale to say, because Hale was actually still awaiting sentencing for having tried to kill Joan. So of course he's not going to admit here to arranging another murder. He's going to say, no, I had nothing to do with it. Seacom told him that it really didn't matter if he denied this, because at this very moment, agents were seizing his phone and computer records, and if he had said anything at all about Joan Lefkow and her family to any of his followers, they would find out. But Hale, he just sat back and smiled and continued to insist that he's like, look, I really had nothing to do with this one. Like, nothing at all. You will find nothing. And Seacom couldn't help but think that Hale seemed so calm and so confident that really deep down he thought to himself, maybe he's telling the truth. Later that same afternoon, Seacom hunched over a desk in the corner of the Chicago Police Command Post. At this point, the police, the FBI, and the U.S. Marshals were all working on this case as part of a joint task force. And all the officers on the task force had moved their equipment into the police precinct so the investigation could be centralized. In a conference room to his left, Seacom could see police officers comparing photos of Matthew Hale's followers to the composite sketches of the two men in the red car who the pastor had seen near the crime scene. And at a desk to Seacom's right, there was another FBI agent who was listening to a recording of a phone call that Hale had recently made to his mother. The FBI at this point was taping all of Hale's phone calls in case he said anything incriminating. And meanwhile, other task force officers were sorting through this huge pile of letters that Hale had received in prison. However, after going through these letters, there was no mention of the Lefkows anywhere. However, at some point, Seacom would join these other officers and continue to sort through all this mail in case something got missed. And as he was sorting through, months worth of mail, something actually did catch his attention. For months, Hale had been exchanging letters with this woman whose name was Kathleen Robertazzo. Basically every other day they were speaking. And Hale did not write to anybody else nearly that often, not even his own family. So this woman was clearly very important. Now, on the surface, nothing in these letters between Hale and Kathleen was incriminating. However, given the frequency of communication, Seacom had to wonder if maybe these two could be talking in code. Like maybe they are talking about the Lefkows, but we just can't tell. The return address on these letters was for a suburb in Chicago, about 30 miles away from the prison where Hale was at. So Seacom bundled up all the letters from Kathleen and stuck them inside of an envelope. He would need them as evidence to get a search warrant. The next evening, March 2nd, 2005, Special Agent Douglas Seacom led a team of FBI agents up the driveway of a suburban home just outside of Chicago. And as they made their way up the driveway, they saw the car, parked there, was red, just like the car the pastor had seen outside the church that had been loitering near where Michael and Donna had been killed. Seacom made his way up to the front door and he knocked. And then a moment later, a woman answered, and he said, "Are you Kathleen Robertazzo?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, "Okay." And he held up a search warrant and he said, "We're here to search your house." And so Seacom stayed outside with Kathleen while the other agents went inside and swept the whole house. And Kathleen seemed really annoyed by this whole thing, but definitely not that surprised. And so while the team was searching the home, Seacom turned to Kathleen and asked her about her relationship with Matthew Hale. And he also asked her if she agreed with his, white supremacist views. And Kathleen admitted that, she did have a relationship with Matthew, but she corrected Seacom and said, "I'm not a white supremacist, I'm a white separatist." Seacom sighed and moved on to asking Kathleen about her whereabouts on the day of Michael and Donna's murders. And Kathleen insisted that she had nothing to do with that. She gave Seacom her alibi for the whole day of February 28th, and while Seacom was writing down the details on his notepad, the other agents came back out of the house carrying a computer. When Kathleen began complaining that she needed that computer for her work, Seacom told her that they'd return it as soon as they searched it. And then before Seacom put his notepad away, he looked down to the driveway and he looked at Kathleen's red car. And he remembered that he actually hadn't written down the license plate or the make or the model. But as he's looking at this car, he's realizing that there's no way this car matched the description of the pastor's red car that he had seen loitering outside of the church. Like, this was definitely not the same car that was suspected of being involved in the murder. 2 days later, on the evening of Friday, March 4th, so now 4 days after Michael and Donna were killed, Special Agent Seacom carried a cup of coffee into a meeting room with the other officers on the task force, and he looked around the room and everybody just looked completely exhausted. It would turn out Kathleen's alibi had checked out, and her red car was definitely not the red car that had been spotted by the pastor, and there had been nothing on her computer that they had taken to search. So basically, she was cleared. And so Seacom and his fellow FBI agents, over the past couple of days, this is right after Kathleen was cleared, they had gone ahead and expanded their search and began interviewing more and more of Matthew Hale's followers. And a lot of them were very confrontational, and at least 3 people were detained for starting fights with the investigators. But one by one, their alibis began to check out, and so none of them were tied to Michael and Donna's murders, at least not yet. Now, a lot of Hale's followers had criminal records, so Seacom was hoping that maybe once fingerprint evidence came back from the crime lab, it would turn up a match. But deep down, realistically, Seacom was starting to doubt that anybody in Hale's circle was behind this. Additionally, the task force had investigated that gang leader Joan had mentioned, Sean Peters, as well as that armed robber, Richard Young, and they both also had been cleared as suspects. And so now, Seacom couldn't help but feel like, we're 4 days into this investigation, this pretty high-profile investigation, and it sort of seems like we really don't have much to show for it. Now, it was the case that there were still dozens of other people on Joan's court docket that maybe could have wanted to kill her that Joan was not aware of, but it was going to take time to keep sorting through all these people, and right now they didn't have traction in any one direction. It was like everything was sort of becoming a dead end. And so as Seacom is sitting in this room full of the other agents, and they're all sort of at a loss for what to do next, he was thinking to himself, is it possible that we've all just sort of wrongfully jumped to conclusions? We all basically assumed that this attack was, targeted at Joan. But Seacom's thinking to himself, he couldn't remember any other case where a judge's family was killed and not the judge themselves. Just then, Seacom's supervisor from the Chicago FBI office kicked off the meeting by announcing that the agency was putting up a $50,000 reward to the public for information on the murders. Now, the task force by this point had received over 200 tips, but the supervisor said, clearly that wasn't enough, and so we're going to use this reward to try to entice people who might have been too afraid to come forward. We'll pay them, and so hopefully this leads to better tips. The next Tuesday, so 9 days after Michael and Donna's murders, Seacom walked into the command post. The task force had been working all weekend, following up on hundreds and hundreds of calls that had come in since the reward money was announced. But it still didn't really seem like they were getting anywhere. And so Seacom, he sat down at his desk and he opened up a folder and he was about to get started when his cell phone rang. And he answered it, and it was the deputy director of the crime lab. And so Seacom's heart began to pound with anticipation as the deputy director told him that they had analyzed those fingerprints found on that beer bottle in the basement of the crime scene up in the window ledge, and after they had run it through the database, they had found a match. Based on forensic evidence and a confession from the killer, this is what police believe happened to Michael Lefkow and Donna Humphrey on February 28, 2005. Around 4:30 a.m., while everybody in the Lefkow house was still asleep, the killer smashed through that basement window and climbed down into the basement, and with them was a gun. Their plan was to hide in the utility closet all day, and then once everybody inside the house cleared out, they would leave the utility closet, sneak upstairs, and they would wait. And when the time was right, they would jump out, and they would ambush the person that they wanted to seek revenge on. But things did not go according to plan. Around 9 a.m., the killer was still in the closet when they heard footsteps coming downstairs, coming down the hallway and into the office where they were. And then they heard the sound of somebody sitting in that desk chair and papers shuffling around. And then a moment later, they heard the sound of footsteps as somebody approached the closet. And then before long, the closet doors opened and there was this man standing there looking really surprised. He was on crutches and he's looking at the killer. And the killer just panicked and they raised their gun and they shot this man point blank in the head. And he crumpled to the ground and the killer's looking down and there's just blood going everywhere. And they're like, I can't believe what I've done. And then a moment later, the killer hears somebody calling out, Michael, is that you? And he looks down the hallway and he sees this elderly woman shuffling down the hallway looking really concerned, who clearly just heard the gunshot, and sort of in a continued state of panic, the killer rushed out of the closet, went down the hallway, raised the gun, and shot this woman in the head as well. And as Donna is bleeding all over the hallway, the killer put their gun away, reached down, scooped her up, and dragged her over into the office and sort of dropped her next to Michael. At this point, the killer's looking down at what they've done and they're thinking, well, at this point, I better make sure they really are dead. So they pull out their gun again and they shoot Donna and Michael one more time, just to make sure they would not talk to anyone about what they had seen. After that, the killer went back into the utility closet and their eyes landed on that pack of beer sitting on the floor. And they felt like that was exactly what they needed right now to calm their nerves. So they reached down and they pulled out one of those beers and they cracked it open and they took a sip while they thought about what their next move was going to be. And so as the killer is drinking this beer, they're thinking to themselves, well, I've just killed 2 people that I did not intend to kill. Those were not my targets. And so they felt kind of bad, like 2 basically innocent people had been murdered here. And so it made the killer think, like, should I still stick around and wait for my intended target? And eventually they decided, you know what, I need to change my plan. And so the killer, they set their beer bottle down on the windowsill. Then they went and found a sponge and some bleach, and they began to try to clean up all the blood in the hallway. But as they're doing this, they're realizing there's just so much blood out here. There's bodies and lots more blood in the office. Like, this is too much. Like, I can't possibly clean all this. And so finally, around 1:15 p.m., the killer just sort of was like, well, this is as good as I can do in terms of cleanup. I'm just going to leave. And so they did. They left the house, and they left behind that bottle in the windowsill that would have their DNA and fingerprints all over it. The killer was a man named Bart Ross, and his intended target was Joan Lefkow. But Bart was not like a hardened criminal. Bart was a cancer patient who had tried to sue his doctors after he lost part of his jaw during treatment. Ross had developed a vendetta against these doctors who had left him disfigured. And over the last few years, he'd become increasingly paranoid and detached from reality, and he ultimately blamed Joan Lefkow for dismissing his medical malpractice suit and preventing him from getting justice. And so Bart had put together this list of 25 doctors, lawyers, and judges he wanted to kill, and Joan just happened to be at the top of the list. But after going into her home with the intent to kill Joan, but actually just killing Michael and Donna, Ross was so shaken up by it that he gave up on attacking Joan and just left the scene. But he obviously left behind crucial clues that got him caught. Ross's fingerprints and DNA were found inside of Joan's home, not just on that beer bottle, but elsewhere in the house. However, his fingerprints and DNA were not found on those cigarette butts in the Coke can that was left on the curb where that suspicious red car had been parked. And also, Ross looked nothing like the composite sketches of those 2 men that were seen inside of that red car, so in the end, the investigators believed that the red car probably had nothing to do with the murders, and Ross simply acted alone. On March 9th, one day after the fingerprint results came back, Wisconsin police officers spotted Ross's van near a federal courthouse in Milwaukee. But as they approached his van, Ross fatally shot himself. However, inside of his van, police found a note confessing in detail to the murders of Michael Lefkow and Donna Humphrey. On the evening of April 28, 2002, 38-year-old Rhonda Boggs sat on the couch of her mother-in-law's house in the quiet city of Pataskala, Ohio, nervously watching the clock. At her feet, her 2.5-year-old daughter, Amanda, was playing with a stuffed animal. It was 6:30 p.m., and Rhonda's husband, Dave, was supposed to call any minute. Dave was currently being incarcerated at the county jail. Dave had been sentenced to 2 weeks behind bars for failing to pay child support to one of his exes. And while Rhonda was obviously not thrilled about this, she also knew she should not be surprised. When Rhonda had first met Dave about 12 years earlier, it was his carefree personality that she had really fallen in love with. He was in a rock band, and she had loved going to his shows and dancing in the front row. It all felt glamorous and exciting and like they were going to stay young forever. But now they were both 38, with a toddler to look after, and bills to pay. And Dave, he really just kept on partying and playing rock star, while all their responsibilities sort of fell to Rhonda. She had barely been to any of his shows since Amanda had been born, in part because it wasn't really the kind of scene you could bring a baby to. A lot of the guys Dave hung around with were hard drinkers and drug addicts and ex-cons. And so now, after almost 4 years of marriage, Rhonda was finally starting to see Dave for what he was, which was not carefree. Dave was really just kind of reckless. The phone rang and Rhonda picked it up. And as expected, it was Dave. And what Rhonda really wanted to say to him was that she was upset and seriously considering divorce, and that in fact, she'd already taken his name off her retirement plan. But at the same time, she saw her mother-in-law standing in the doorway, clearly listening, and so instead of saying what she really wanted to say, she just said, "Hey Dave, how are you doing?" An hour later, back at her own home, Rhonda put a casserole into the oven, and then she turned on cartoons for Amanda, and then went outside to mow the lawn before it got too dark. Rhonda was used to doing almost everything around the house herself, since Dave was practically never home anyway. But now that he was, in jail, she had to literally do everything, including, mowing the grass on a Sunday night. So Rhonda wheeled the lawnmower out of the garage and into the yard, and then she pulled the cord to start the engine. But like everything else in their little house, the lawnmower was on the verge of breaking down, and it kept shutting off. While Rhonda struggled, she noticed her neighbor coming out of the house across the street, and he waved to Rhonda as he came down his own driveway, sort of telling her like, hey, turn off that lawnmower. And once she did, and once it was quiet enough to actually hear each other, he shouted from across the street and asked if she wanted to borrow his lawnmower that did work. Rhonda found herself looking around the yard at all the tall grass and saw how dark it was already getting. And then she checked her watch and saw that, her casserole was going to be done in just a minute here. And so she said to her neighbor that she really appreciated the offer, but it didn't really matter because, you know what, she doesn't have time to do this anyways. She has to go back inside. So Rhonda said bye to her neighbor and then pushed her defective lawnmower back inside the garage. And then she made a mental note to call Dave's cousin, Nick, the following day to see if maybe he could come by and fix her lawnmower. Nick worked as a maintenance man at a big apartment complex, and even though he lived 45 minutes away, he'd been helping Rhonda around the house while Dave was behind bars. Just last week, he had fixed up her washing machine, and he called all the time just to check in. And so now, Rhonda went back inside the house, into the kitchen, and took the casserole out of the oven just before the timer rang. She cut the casserole into 2 pieces and brought those pieces into the dining room and set them on the table. Then she walked over and turned off the TV, scooped up her daughter, and brought her over to the table. It was getting late, and all Rhonda really wanted to do here was just eat quickly and go to bed. But for every bite that made it into Amanda's mouth, another wound up on the floor. And so Rhonda knew that, at the end of dinner, she would have to do another round of cleanup before she could finally go to sleep. But Rhonda knew, Amanda couldn't help it. She was a little kid. And so she reached over and took her daughter's fork and began helping her eat, to not only minimize the mess, but also to help her kid out. And in reality, Amanda was actually the thing preventing Rhonda from just pulling the trigger on a divorce. She didn't know if she could handle being a single mother. It was hard enough having Dave gone for a few weeks, that she couldn't even imagine doing this all alone by herself forever. And since she already knew Dave was bad at paying child support, as that is the reason he was in jail right now, she figured if she was a single mom, even if he was ordered to pay her, she would likely have to rely on paying the bills herself. She would need to get a job and make money. Now, Rhonda did have a job now as an office assistant, but she wasn't sure if that would be enough to fully support herself and her daughter without any additional financial help. But just then, as Rhonda was scooping up another bite of casserole for her daughter, she heard a noise outside that almost sounded like heavy footsteps. She turned around, and through the curtains, she could see the silhouette of a person clearly coming up her driveway. The next morning, Monday, April 29th, Rhonda's coworker, Gary Pulowski, noticed that Rhonda was running late for her shift in the office at Hamilton Home Products, which was a heating equipment company. And this was strange because Rhonda had actually never been late before in the entire time that she had worked there. So Gary began asking around to see if anybody knew where Rhonda was or if maybe she had called in or something. But his coworkers all shrugged and said they hadn't heard from her since she left the office on Friday night. And so eventually, Gary tried calling Rhonda's landline at her house to see if she was home. But after calling several times, Rhonda never picked up. He waited for a while to see if maybe she would call back. But when he still hadn't heard from her after an hour, he started to worry that, she might have run into car trouble. Like maybe she was stranded somewhere with her car. He knew it was about a 15-mile drive from her house in Pataskala to the office here, just outside of Columbus. And back in 2002, not everyone had a cell phone, and he didn't know if she did. So if her car had broken down, she might be stranded without a way to call for help. And so Gary decided he would just get in his own car and drive the route from the office back to her house to literally see if he could find Rhonda on the side of the road. Gary drove all the way out to Pataskala, keeping his eyes peeled for Rhonda's car on the side of the road, but there was no sign of it. It was not until he finally turned the corner onto Rhonda's street that he saw her car, and her car was parked in the driveway of her white-paneled one-story house. And at this, Gary's stomach kind of balled up into a knot, because he realized that, Rhonda had clearly not left for work at all. And he knew that if she had just stayed home this whole time without calling in or calling anybody back, that something bad had to have happened. And so Gary pulled up to her house, and he got out of his car and walked up to the front door, and he knocked, but there was no answer. So after a minute, he went around and knocked on the back door, and there was still no answer back there either. So he walked back around to the front of the house, and he was about to leave when he saw the drapes rustling in one of the front windows. He squinted at the window, and he saw, what was causing the movement of the drapes was Rhonda's toddler daughter, Amanda, looking out the window. And her face was red like she'd been crying for a long time. And so now, Gary started to panic. But he tried to keep his voice calm as he ran over and shouted through the window and told Amanda he was a friend of her mother's and convinced her to open the door so he could help her. It took a minute for Amanda to figure out what Gary was asking, but eventually she got it, and she disappeared from the window, and a moment later, the front door opened. And so Gary walked over and he stepped through the front door, and the first thing he saw were bloody footprints on the living room carpet. Gary instinctively scooped Amanda up in his arms, and he ran across the street, banged on the neighbor's door, and told them to call the police. Not long after, Pataskala police would arrive at Rhonda's house, and they would search the inside, and they would find Rhonda, and she was found stabbed to death in her own kitchen. This was the first homicide in Pataskala in 6 years, and there were only 17 officers in the whole police department, and the crime scene unit was run out of a refurbished ambulance. So, Police Chief Chris Forshee didn't have a ton of resources to throw at this case, but he called in all available officers and sent them to the crime scene. And then he headed out there himself to make sure they did the job right. By the time Forshee pulled up to the house, his officers had already sealed off the perimeter. He ducked under the crime scene tape, walked inside the house, and followed the sound of footsteps and clicking cameras into the kitchen, where a woman was lying in a pool of blood on the tile floor. An officer told Forshee that the victim had been identified as Rhonda Boggs, and it was her coworker who had come to check on her when she hadn't shown up for work that morning that ultimately prompted a 911 call that led to the discovery of the body. The officer also told Forshee that Rhonda's toddler daughter had been found, uninjured, in the house with her body. And so Forshee knelt down to examine the body. And right away, he saw at least, more than a dozen stab wounds on Rhonda's head, her neck, her chest, and her shoulders. The sheer number of wounds and the blood all over the kitchen suggested there had to have been a struggle, and that from the looks of it, Rhonda had fought very hard with her attacker. The remnants of what appeared to be a casserole were sitting on the stove, and Rhonda was fully dressed. So Forshee figured the crime must have happened sometime before she went to bed, so between dinner and bedtime. And then Forshee wondered if, her poor daughter had been awake, or maybe even in the room when this happened. After the scene had been photographed, Forshee gave the green light for the coroner to actually physically lift Rhonda's body up off the ground onto a stretcher. And when the coroner's staff hoisted her up, Forshee noticed something lying underneath her body. It was a steak knife with blood all over the blade. Forshee looked around the kitchen and realized the black handle on that knife matched the set of knives on the countertop. It appeared that Rhonda had been killed with a knife from her own kitchen, which meant her killer did not show up to the house with their murder weapon. This suggested that this murder was likely a heat-of-the-moment crime, rather than something that had been planned out. While Forshee's officers finished collecting forensic evidence in the kitchen, Forshee himself walked through the rest of the house. It looked like it had been completely ransacked. The jewelry box in the bedroom was empty, and the dresser drawers were open, and piles of Rhonda's clothes were strewn all over the floor. And then in the dining room, they found a purse that had been overturned with all of its contents spilled out, and clearly it looked like somebody had been sifting through it. And so Forshee thought that, between the sort of ransacked appearance of the house and also the weapon of opportunity, that it seemed like this could have been a robbery gone wrong. However, there was one factor that did seem to complicate things, or at least make it seem like this could have been something else, and that was that there was no sign of forced entry. Just then, Forshee heard a commotion near the front door, and so he walked over, and he saw there was a woman trying to push her way into the house. And her face was all red, and she was crying, and she was shouting at the officers, demanding to know what happened. Forshee took this woman outside and tried to calm her down, and she would eventually tell him that her name was Kim Davis, and she was Rhonda's sister. Once she'd caught her breath, Forshee explained to her what he already knew, which was that unfortunately her sister Rhonda had been found stabbed to death inside of her home, And the running theory at this point, at least his theory, was this was a robbery gone wrong. And potentially, because there was no sign of forced entry, it could indicate that it was somebody that, Rhonda potentially knew and who she would have, let into the house if she saw them. Now, Kim was obviously extremely upset by this, and so for a minute, Forshee just consoled her. But he really needed to kind of press this investigation, and so once she had kind of calmed down a little bit, he asked her if she knew of anybody who might have wanted to hurt Rhonda. And Kim immediately said no. She couldn't imagine her sister having any enemies. But after sitting with that question for a moment, Kim said that actually there was one person who might have had a problem with Rhonda, and that was her husband, Dave. Kim said that Rhonda and Dave's marriage had been on the rocks for a while, and in fact, Rhonda had told her recently that she was thinking about getting a divorce. But Kim said, Dave actually is currently in jail, so I don't see how he could have done this. He was literally in jail at the time this happened. Still, though, she thought it was possible that, Dave could have been involved one way or another. He might have paid somebody to come here and do this, or maybe put one of his friends up to it. Forshee promised Kim he would look into this, but he was already feeling pretty skeptical. I mean, if Dave couldn't even pay child support, what was the likelihood that he was able to afford a hitman? And also, the murder weapon appeared to come from Rhonda's kitchen, and so that didn't really suggest that the suspect had been planning to kill her when they got there. So again, sort of takes away from the idea that a hitman was used in this murder. But at this point, Forshee thought their best chance to figure out what actually happened here was actually to speak to the only other person who was at the scene of the crime that they knew about. And that was Rhonda's own 2-year-old daughter, Amanda. Later that day, a social worker from Child Services pulled up outside the house, and Forshee walked out to greet her. And he said to her that before she took custody of Amanda, he was hoping that, she could help him talk to this girl and see what she knew about the murder, because she was here, when it happened, and there was nobody else who witnessed it but her. The social worker nodded, and so Forshee took her across the street to the neighbor's house, where Amanda had been staying all morning. Now, Forshee didn't know if this little girl would be able to tell them anything at all. I mean, of course, she could be in complete shock. She's also 2. And he also knew that even if she did tell them stuff, they wouldn't necessarily be reliable because, again, she's 2 years old and she very likely is in shock. But regardless, Forshee knew he had to try. So he stood in the corner of the living room while the social worker sat down on the floor with Amanda and asked her what she had seen the night before. And to Forshee's surprise, the little girl looked up at the social worker and she jerked her little hand toward her neck in what looked very much like a stabbing motion. And then in a quiet voice, she said her mother had fallen down and gone to sleep. Then the social worker asked her if anybody else had been there. And Forshee felt himself holding his breath, waiting for Amanda to answer. And there was a moment of silence before Amanda said, "Uncle Nick." A few hours later, Chief Forshee was still at the crime scene when 2 officers pulled up in a cruiser and took this grungy-looking man out of the back seat and escorted him into the house. This was not the Uncle Nick that Amanda had named. It was Amanda's own father, Dave Boggs, who had been in jail when his wife was murdered. Now, Forshee was absolutely planning to speak to this Uncle Nick, but first he wanted to gather as much information as possible about him. During Amanda's conversation with the social worker, she had said repeatedly that Uncle Nick had hurt Mommy. But even though this 2-year-old girl seemed very definitive about this, Forshee needed an adult perspective before he acted. A judge had let Dave Boggs out of jail early because of his wife's murder, and Forshee had ensured that Dave was escorted to the crime scene so Forshee could speak to him before Dave got a chance to speak to anybody else. And so now Forshee met Dave and the officers at the door and then guided them into the living room where they sat Dave down on the couch. They filled him in on what had happened to his wife, but really before he could react to that, they also told him that they needed him to do a walkthrough of the house with them to try to identify what might have been stolen, which could help them figure out who did this. But first, Forshee said he had a very important question. He asked Dave, "Who is Uncle Nick?" And at this, Dave, who to this point had just looked completely shocked by what he was being told, began to look more confused. And he told Forshee that Uncle Nick was what his daughter called his second cousin. He said his real name was Richard Nicholas Robinson, and he had been helping Rhonda out while Dave was in jail. Dave said Nick had probably been at the house almost every day, fixing one thing or another, but he said he didn't understand why Forshee was asking about him because, there's no way he would have hurt Rhonda. I mean, he really looked out for her, and also for Amanda. But for now, Forshee was not going to answer that question. Dave's information was enough for him to go outside, get on his radio, and broadcast a bulletin asking all police departments in the area to be on the lookout for Nick Robinson. Less than an hour later, a police cruiser found Nick Robinson's SUV on State Route 37 just outside of Pataskala, and they pulled him over and they ordered him out of the vehicle, and as soon as he was out, they pushed him to the ground with a gun to the back of his head and cuffed him. And as they did this, they noticed a dark spot on Nick's baseball cap that looked a lot like blood. As they put Nick in the back of the cruiser, he kept asking them what was going on, but they didn't tell him. Instead, they searched his SUV, and there was cardboard laid out in the back with reddish-brown smears all over it, which also appeared to be blood. And then when the officers got back into their cruiser, Nick asked them, "Is this about Rhonda?" By the time this arrest happened, Chief Forshee was at Nick Robinson's house questioning his wife, Debbie. So while he did that, he dispatched one of his best and only detectives, Bruce Brooks, to go down to police headquarters to handle Nick's interrogation. When Detective Brooks walked into the interview room, immediately he could see that Nick, who was resting his head in his hands, looked very pale and nauseous. When he asked him if he was okay, Nick said he was just hungover from a long night of drinking. He said he had been at a bar in Columbus until around 10:30 p.m., and then he had gone to another bar in Lancaster, which was a town nearby where he lived. And then he had finally come home around 1:30 a.m. and passed out on his couch. Nick swore he didn't know anything about what happened to Rhonda, and only found out she was dead when he saw it on the news. And as for the blood the police found in his SUV, he said it was just animal blood from a hunting trip. But Brooks was not buying this, because he had heard Amanda, Rhonda's daughter, say Uncle Nick hurts Mom. And while, of course, you can't take a 2-year-old's testimony as absolutely reliable, but when she had said it, she said it very definitively and even gestured at her neck like she was stabbing herself. And Rhonda was found stabbed to death. So he asked Nick, if his alibi essentially was that he was too drunk to have committed this murder, well then how could he be sure, given he was too drunk, that he hadn't killed Rhonda in an alcohol-fueled blackout? If he can't remember, it's just as likely that he could have done it. But Nick just shook his head and said no. And no seemed to be Nick's answer to just about every question Brooks asked him. And eventually, the detective got frustrated, because basically everything he asked Nick, he denied. And so eventually he told Nick that Rhonda's daughter had seen the whole thing. And he told him to imagine that little girl on the witness stand, having some defense lawyer poke and prod her about the most traumatic event she had ever experienced, the murder of her own mother. And when he said that, a crack seemed to appear in Nick's sort of outward demeanor of denial. Like clearly he saw how awful this thing really was. And then finally, a little after midnight, so 6 hours into this interrogation, Nick just agreed to take a lie detector test. And when the results came back, it showed very clearly that Nick had failed. He had lied. But instead of confessing at this point, Nick dug in and swore up and down that he really was innocent. So Brooks pulled out the last threat he could think of, which was that if Nick didn't confess now, he could be looking at the death penalty. And at that point, it was very clear. Nick cracked. Like that absolutely affected him. And so after a long silence following this threat of the death penalty, Nick said that, maybe he did have something to do with what happened, but he just couldn't remember it. From there on, Brooks kept on pushing and pushing until around 5 a.m. when Nick finally completely broke down and confessed to the murder. He said he had gone to Rhonda's house in between the 2 bars that he had visited, and he tried to kiss her. She pulled away and she grabbed a knife, and when Nick tried to take the knife from her, he said he accidentally stabbed her. As the sun came up, officers drove Nick to the Licking County Jail and officially booked him for Rhonda's murder. Later that morning, Chief Forshee stood in front of a group of reporters outside the police station and praised his officers for catching Rhonda Boggs' killer and getting a confession in less than 24 hours. But later that week, Detective Brooks was in his office wrapping up paperwork when a secretary stuck her head in the door and said there was somebody on the phone for him. Brooks picked it up, and the man on the other end of the line introduced himself as Bob Sisko. And he said he was the bandmate of Rhonda's husband, Dave Boggs, and he did not think Nick was guilty of this murder. Bob said on the evening that Rhonda was killed, another one of their former bandmates, a guy named Chris Williams, had stopped by his house. And Chris had seemed very nervous and sort of keyed up. He was pacing around and smoking cigarette after cigarette, and it just seemed like he was very mentally preoccupied with something. Now, Bob said Chris had actually in the past already robbed Rhonda and Dave's house. He had stolen a bunch of band equipment and sold it for drug money. And so when Bob Sisko saw on the news that, Rhonda was dead and her house appeared to have been robbed, he couldn't shake this feeling that Chris might have been involved. It just seemed too similar to be a coincidence. Brooks wrote all this down and thanked Bob for the information, but he wasn't sure how seriously to take this tip, since they already had a confession from their primary suspect. But he spoke to Forshee, and the chief decided to go ahead and re-interview Rhonda's 2-year-old daughter, just to cover their bases. A few days later, so about 2 weeks after Rhonda's murder, Chief Forshee waited by the phone in his office, anxiously watching the clock. He knew that the social worker who had spoken to Amanda the first time was in the process of interviewing her a second time. And any minute now, this social worker should be calling him with an update. Now, Forshee was hopeful that the little girl would just repeat the same story that she had told on the day of her mother's murder. But when his phone finally rang and Forshee picked it up, he learned that that is not what happened. The social worker said that this time, when she asked Amanda who she saw on the night of the murder, she did not say anything about Uncle Nick. Instead, she said, Bob did it. When Forshee heard this, he immediately got a pretty anxious feeling. He'd been afraid from the beginning that, a toddler was not a reliable eyewitness, and she could just be throwing out whatever names popped into her head. But he also thought it was a very strange coincidence that of all the people she could have named other than Uncle Nick, she said Bob. The same guy who had just called the station trying to, cast blame onto some other guy the police had never even heard of. Something just felt off. But as Forshee thought about it, he decided, it didn't really change anything. Nick had already confessed, like he said he did this. So they didn't really need Amanda as a witness to make the charges against Nick stick. 5 days later, a grand jury officially indicted Nick on murder charges. And to the huge surprise of investigators, Nick pled not guilty. So he was now claiming he had given a false confession and that he was not Rhonda Boggs' killer. About 7 months later, in December of 2002, a man named Matt Sauer stepped into a bar called Merry Melodies in Columbus, Ohio. He went up to the counter and pulled a manila folder out of his messenger bag, and he asked the bartender if he recognized the man in the photograph inside. The bartender looked down at the photo for a second, and then looked back up at Sauer and nodded and said, "Yes, that's Nick Robinson. He was here 8 months ago, on the night of the murder, and I've been waiting for you guys to come here and talk to me about it, because I know he was here on the night of the murder." Sauer was kind of caught off guard by how sure the bartender was, and so he asked them, how can you be so sure it was him, and how do you know he was here on the night of the murder? How can you remember that? But the bartender had a quick answer. He said the reason he remembered Nick is he had been wearing this very unique, unforgettable t-shirt that night with this obscene joke on it about women's bodies, so he just remembered it. Bartender said Nick had stayed there on the night of the murder until 10:15 or maybe 10:30. The bartender was absolutely certain. And so again, the bartender said to Sauer, I'm just pretty surprised it took this long for you all to come here and confirm his whereabouts. I've known this. Sauer closed his folder and thanked the bartender and then just set his business card down on the counter. And when the bartender picked it up, he looked surprised because Matt Sauer was not actually a police officer. He was a private investigator, and he'd been hired by Nick Robinson to clear his name. Sauer knew this was going to be a tough job, because Nick had already confessed to Rhonda Boggs' murder. But Sauer was hoping that this interview with the bartender would help him poke a massive hole in the case against him. And so now that Sauer had gotten this testimony from the bartender that did appear to poke this hole in the case, Sauer left the bar, got in his car, and drove to the second bar Nick had claimed to be at on the night of Rhonda's murder. It was called the Fairview Inn in Lancaster. And when he got there, he showed that staff the same photo, and just like the first bartender, they all remembered Nick as well. They said he was there on the night of April 28th, the night of the murder, and they remembered because of his distinctive t-shirt. And so now Sauer knew he was onto something, because the prosecution's case said that Nick had left Merry Melody's bar, that first bar Sauer had gone to, driven to Rhonda's house and killed her, and then went to this bar, the Fairview Inn. But the staff at both bars said Nick was wearing this same distinctive t-shirt. And Sauer knew that if Nick had stabbed Rhonda to death in between these two bars, wouldn't that shirt have been covered in blood? And wouldn't, the Fairview Inn staff have not just remembered that it was this distinctive shirt, but the distinctive shirt that had blood all over it? Like, that would also be a detail they would recall. But they didn't. They just said he had that shirt on, nothing else. A few days later, Sauer drove back to Merry Melody's bar. But this time he didn't go inside. Instead, he just pulled his car into their parking lot and started his stopwatch. And then once it was going, he pulled out of the parking lot, turned down the street, and drove all the way to Fairview Inn. And when he reached their parking lot, he checked his stopwatch, and the drive had taken, about 45 minutes. The prosecution's case against Nick had him leaving Merry Melody's bar, murdering Rhonda, and driving all the way to the Fairview, all within 30 to 45 minutes. But Sauers' experiment here with his stopwatch proved there was simply no way for Nick to have driven all the way to Rhonda's house, committed the murder, and then made it back to the Fairview Inn in that same window of time. It just wasn't possible. Which meant Nick's alibi was airtight, and he could not have been the killer. Now, Sauer just had to figure out who actually was. Matt Sauer showed the evidence he had found to Nick's defense attorney, who then brought that evidence to the judge in the case, and they also asked the judge for an order to test a key piece of evidence that the Pataskala police had never even sent to the crime lab, the murder weapon. And so the judge agreed to test the knife, and a month later, in January of 2003, the evidence came back from the lab, and they discovered there was DNA on the knife from someone other than Rhonda. Investigators were not sure who the DNA belonged to, because back in 2003, it isn't like you had this huge bank to test it against. You basically had to test DNA 1-to-1. But they were able to do that with Nick's DNA, and were able to confirm that it was not his DNA on the murder weapon. And so this cast serious doubt on Nick as a suspect, but it wasn't enough to clear his name. Not until Sauer could figure out who that other set of DNA belonged to. And so Sauer dug through the police files on the case, and he realized there were a lot of potential suspects the police had never even bothered to look at closely, or at all. There was Rhonda's soon-to-be ex-husband, Dave, who'd been flagged by Rhonda's sister on day one. Dave obviously could not have committed the murder himself because he was in jail. But, like the sister suggested, it's possible he could have recruited somebody else to do it. And so all of Dave's friends, his acquaintances, the people he met in jail potentially, were suspects too. There was also Chris Williams, the former bandmate who had previously robbed Dave and Rhonda's house once before and sold Dave's guitars for drug money. And of course, there was Bob Sisko, the man who had actually called in the tip about Chris. And at one point, Rhonda's own daughter had said Bob had been in the house during the murder. And so maybe that was Bob Sisko. Any of those people could have been Rhonda's killer. But since there was so little investigation done, Sauer was essentially starting over from square one, almost 9 months after the crime. The killer could even be somebody who the police never even knew about, because they had never really even bothered to focus on anybody but Nick. And so with little concrete to go off of, Sauer decided that, before he began investigating 87 different people, he would start with the sort of one concrete thing he had, which is they knew what items had been taken from Rhonda's house during the murder. And so what he decided he would do is try to track down those items, and hopefully they would lead him to the actual killer. A few days later, Sauer stepped into a pawn shop in Columbus and walked slowly down the aisle, scanning the shelves for some of the items that he knew had been taken from Rhonda and Dave's house. But like all the other pawn shops he'd been to that day, he hadn't found anything, and when he got to the end of this aisle, he knew this pawn shop as well did not have any of these missing items. Now, it was entirely possible that the items that had been stolen had not been pawned off yet, or maybe they had been pawned off in some other part of the country or something, but it just seemed kind of likely that if they had been pawned, they might be sort of roughly in the area. But so far, he had not found anything promising. And so after leaving this pawn shop and going to another and then another and still not finding any of the stolen items, Sauer finally decided to call it a day and head back home. However, on his ride back home, Sauer found himself stopped at a stoplight. And as he was idling there, he just happened to look out the window, and on the other side of the road, he saw a Bureau of Motor Vehicles, a DMV. And when he saw the DMV, it was like something kind of rattled loose in his mind. He remembered that one of the persons of interest on his list had been arrested for car theft about a week after Rhonda's murder. But, according to the police files, that suspect owned a car of their own, a blue Cadillac. So why would they need to steal another car if they already owned one? And so on a whim, Sauer pulled into the parking lot of this DMV. He went inside and he went up to one of the clerks and he asked them to look into this particular blue Cadillac. He gave the clerk the license plate number and he quickly found out that on April 30th, 2002, so one day after Rhonda's body had been found, that blue Cadillac had been sold to a woman in Columbus whose name was Letitia Gordon. And so Sauer left the DMV and drove straight to Letitia's house, and he knocked on the door. And the woman who opened it looked a bit scared when he introduced himself as an investigator, but she also did not seem surprised. Letitia told Sauer that she knew why he was there. It was because of the blue Cadillac that she had bought. She said that she had bought that car off a stranger right off the street who had offered to sell it to her for just $300, something she couldn't pass up. However, when she got home with this new car, she looked inside of it, and she found there was all this stuff piled up in the back of the car, which included clothes, jewelry, and a purse with somebody's photo ID inside. And the name on that ID was Rhonda Boggs. And so, with his suspicions now confirmed, Sauer was finally able to reconstruct what really happened to Rhonda Boggs on the night of April 28th, 2002. On that night, while Rhonda Boggs was finishing up dinner with her 2-year-old daughter, her killer was parking their blue Cadillac just down the block. They eventually got out and stormed over to Rhonda's house in a total fury, with their heart pounding and their heads swimming, and they stomped up her driveway, and they rang the doorbell. And when Rhonda opened up the door, she looked confused and a bit scared to see this person. She asked them what they were doing there, but the killer just brushed past her and stormed into her house, into the kitchen, and began digging through her purse right on the counter. Rhonda tried to stop them, but when she put her hands on them, the killer, without any hesitation, grabbed a nearby steak knife and stabbed Rhonda in the chest. Rhonda, she fell to the ground and tried to stand back up and tried to defend herself, but the killer was on top of her, stabbing her over and over and over again until Rhonda was no longer moving. The killer at that point stood up and backed away from Rhonda's body, which was now lying there in a pool of blood on the kitchen tile. And then they just proceeded to ransack the house and stole whatever money and valuables they could find. And then as they were about to leave, they saw a toddler just standing in the hallway, watching them. The killer paid the child no mind and just hurried right past them out of the house, got back into their blue Cadillac, and spent the rest of the night on a massive drug binge. And then the next morning, they sold that blue Cadillac to a woman in Columbus on the street, accidentally leaving Rhonda's stolen purse, her ID, and jewelry in the back of that car. And nearly a year later, those items would lead investigators to the killer. The killer was Chris Williams, Dave Boggs' former bandmate who had robbed him and Rhonda once before. On the night of the murder, he was high on crack and needed money for his next hit, and Rhonda unfortunately got in the way. Chris was charged with Rhonda's murder, and on March 28, 2005, he was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 20 years to life for Rhonda's murder and a total of 28 years for aggravated robbery, burglary, and escaping from a halfway house. After Chris Williams was charged, all the charges against Nick Robinson were dropped. And for Nick Robinson, this completely changed his life, not just because now he was free, but once he came back home, he stopped drinking and he returned to work, and he sued the city of Pataskala for $3 million in damages. On April 17, 2018, 42-year-old Holly Mackey sat down in aisle seat 14C on a Southwest Airlines plane. That morning, she, along with 143 other passengers and the 5 crew members, would be flying from New York City to Dallas, Texas. And then after that 4-hour flight, Holly would get off that plane and board another plane from Dallas to Oklahoma City, where she lived. But luckily that flight was only about an hour long. After Holly buckled her lap belt, she put her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her, and then she waited to see who was going to be sitting in the 2 seats to her left. A few seconds later, a 43-year-old bank executive and mother of 2 named Jennifer Reardon came walking down the aisle and stopped right outside of row 14 and turned into the aisle towards Holly. And Holly, who was kind of keeping her head down, she noticed there was this person standing outside of her aisle, and so she turned and looked up, and looking down at her was this big bright smile, and Jennifer said to her, "Hey, can I sit next to you? Is anybody using those seats?" And Holly would say, "Nope, I'm here by myself, go right ahead." Unlike other airlines that would assign seats to all of their passengers before they boarded, Southwest Airlines has an open seating plan. What they do is they basically group passengers into boarding groups, but then once that group is on the plane, it's first come, first serve. After Jennifer slid past Holly and made her way to the window seat where she sat down, which was seat 14A, she buckled her lap belt, and then just like Holly, she took her carry-on bag and stuffed it under the seat in front of her, and then she pulled a paperback book out of her bag and started reading it. For the next few minutes, as more and more passengers came onto the plane, nobody took the seat between Holly and Jennifer, because generally speaking, people don't like riding in the middle seat if there is a window or aisle seat available, because it's just not very comfortable sitting between 2 people for hours at a time. But eventually, the only seats left were middle seats. And at some point, this preteen girl who had her head buried in her phone, she comes onto the plane and she works her way down and she stops outside of row 14 and she very politely asks Holly if she can sit between her and Jennifer. And Holly says, absolutely. And so this girl slips past Holly and she sits down in seat 14B. She puts her lap belt on, she takes her carry-on, puts it under the seat in front of her, and then she just goes back to looking at her phone. Now that all of Holly's seatmates had arrived and she would not need to be getting out of the way for more people to come into a row, Holly kind of relaxed for a minute and she pulled out her iPad and she began scanning through the news as she waited for the plane to finish boarding. After all the passengers had been seated, one of the flight attendants closed the airplane door and then they grabbed the microphone and welcomed everyone aboard the plane and thanked them for choosing Southwest Airlines. And then they reminded everyone on board to make sure their seatbelt was fastened, that their tray was in the upright position, that their seat was upright as well, that they had stowed big electronics. And then with the help of several other flight attendants, they went over some basic safety procedures in case of a mid-air emergency. Most of the passengers on this flight were really not paying attention to the safety brief. They were trying to sleep, or they were stowing their stuff, or they were sending one last text message. But Holly, on the other hand, she was paying careful attention. Now, this wasn't totally unusual for her. She was generally safety conscious, but for some reason on this flight, she just had a sense that something bad was about to happen. There was this deep sense of foreboding that she normally didn't feel on flights. And so she found herself really carefully paying attention to these procedures in case something did go wrong. After the brief was over, the attendant who was holding the microphone thanked everyone for listening and then said, sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight. But Holly couldn't do that. Because one, she really did have this weird sense that something was off about this flight, that something bad was going to happen, and she just didn't know why. And then number two, she remembered that she had drank this huge cup of iced coffee before she boarded the plane, and so now she really had to use the bathroom. But the plane had already begun taxiing over to the runway, and an attendant had told her she had to sit down. You can't go to the bathroom now. You gotta wait until we're up in the air. And so Holly, who was now feeling very mentally and physically uncomfortable, uncomfortable, found herself kind of anxiously looking to her left out the window as the plane continued to taxi to the top of the runway. And then once the plane was set, it paused for a second, and then the engines fired, and Holly and the girl next to her and Jennifer all got sucked back into their seat as the plane began hurtling down the track. And so Holly, the girl, and Jennifer, they're all turned, they're looking out the window as the plane is just bombing straight ahead. They're watching the airport kind of disappear out of view, and then they feel the plane begin to get lift, and then they take off. As the plane rapidly ascended, Holly turned away from the window and just sat back and closed her eyes and was just picturing that moment when they reached their cruising altitude, and she would hear that chime in the cabin, and then the captain would come on the intercom and say, "We've reached our cruising altitude. It's now safe to get up and walk around," at which point Holly was going to run to the bathroom. And so when the plane finally got to a point where Holly felt like they were starting to level out, they probably were going to be at their cruising altitude soon, Holly preemptively undid her seatbelt and turned to face the aisle, getting ready for that chime in the cabin so she could get to the bathroom as soon as possible. But that chime didn't happen. Instead, when they reached their cruising altitude, the captain came on the intercom and she would tell everyone that they had reached their cruising altitude, but no one can leave their seats yet. They were expecting some fairly rough air, some turbulence. And so Holly was totally frustrated and disappointed, and she let out this audible grunt out of frustration. And Jennifer, who had her head in her book, she hears this grunt and she turns to look at Holly to make sure she's okay. And at the exact same time, Holly found herself kind of looking down and turning towards the window to look out the window. And she made eye contact with Jennifer. And immediately Holly recognized that Jennifer thought something was wrong with her, and she was kind of looking at her to make sure she was okay. And Holly just goes, "I really have to go to the bathroom." And so at this, the two women kind of laughed about Holly's plight because it was kind of funny that she desperately needed to go but wasn't allowed to. And so eventually Jennifer just said, "I'm sure they'll let you go soon." And then Jennifer went back to her book, and Holly went back to anxiously waiting to use the bathroom, and the girl sitting between them did not care at all. She was not listening to them. She didn't care. She had her head buried in her phone. After several minutes, Holly started to worry that it might be a while before she was allowed to get up and move around, because she's looking at the flight attendants and they're all buckled into their jump seats and they were hitting some turbulence. And so Holly's thinking, okay, I got to do something to take my mind off of this discomfort. Not only the physical discomfort of needing to use the bathroom, but also that strange foreboding. It just was not going away. And she didn't know what it was, but she just had the sense that something bad was going to happen. And so Holly decided she would do some work. And so at 11:04 a.m. Eastern, she reached down below the seat in front of her and began fishing around in her bag for her laptop. Before she could grab it, she heard two deafeningly loud sounds in rapid succession. The first was a popping sound that came from outside of the plane near the left wing. And the left wing was right outside of their window. And then she heard this whooshing sound that went through the entire cabin. It was like a high-powered vacuum. And then the entire cabin became freezing cold as the plane banked hard to the left. After all this happened, in this fraction of a second, Holly sat up, and it was like she was immediately in shock. She's looking out across the other seats, and she sees all those oxygen masks have deployed from the ceiling. People are screaming, the attendants are running up and down the aisle trying to help people put their masks on as the plane is hard banking to the left, and Holly just kind of robotically reaches out and grabs the mask right in front of her, and she tries to put it on, but despite having listened intently to the safety brief, it was like her hands didn't work, and she couldn't get the band to extend long enough to put it over her head. And so she's fumbling with this mask, still in shock. She can't believe this is actually happening. This is how she's gonna die. And then it's like she snaps out of it, and she forgets about the mask, and she turns left to make sure the girl and Jennifer were okay. And what she saw was absolutely horrifying. That popping sound she heard outside of the plane was the sound of the engine underneath the left wing exploding. And when it detonated, the cowling, which is the outside of the engine, it kind of protects the engine, it broke apart. And one of the pieces of this cowling flew and hit the side of the aircraft, and it struck the window of row 14, Holly's row. And when it did that, it shattered the window completely, causing an explosive decompression of the cabin. When even a small hole opens up in a plane flying miles above the earth, that hole will create hurricane-like forces inside of the cabin, and so anything that is not completely anchored down, including people, will get sucked out of that hole. And in this case, that's what happened. When that window broke open, Jennifer, who was sitting closest to it, was immediately sucked through the window. Now, she was not completely ejected because her seatbelt kept her from going completely out the window, but her entire upper half was now wedged outside of the plane. As for the girl sitting next to Jennifer, in between Jennifer and Holly, she was still getting pulled towards the window because Jennifer, even though she had been pulled out, there was still segments of the window that were open. And so there was still suction towards the window. And so Holly instinctively reached over and grabbed this girl and pulled her in tight to her chest. And then with her left arm, she reached behind the girl and grabbed the belt of Jennifer. And she tried to pull Jennifer back into the plane, but she could tell there was no way she could pull her back. The forces pulling Jennifer out of the plane were far too strong. Holly remembers thinking, someone is going to know this is happening. There's got to be a sensor or something. The flight crew has got to be aware that a person is getting pulled out of the plane. But in reality, the captain and the flight crew, they were aware that the left engine had blown up. That was the thing they were actively trying to combat, to try to keep the plane from crashing. But they had no idea about the drama that was unfolding in row 14. And so Holly is holding on to Jennifer, she's holding on to this girl, and she's screaming out for anybody in the plane to please take notice of the fact that Jennifer is stuck out of the plane. But the sound that was being created by this open window was deafening. Nobody could hear anybody else in this plane. Not to mention, the plane is banking hard to the left, and everybody on board believes they're about to die. So no one is looking around, taking stock of what's going on and assessing what to do next. Everybody's in survival mode and is basically just focused on themselves. And so despite Holly yelling out and trying to wave to people, it was worthless. Jennifer was just stuck out the window and no help was coming. And so for several minutes, Holly is just holding on to Jennifer. She's holding on to this girl. She's screaming out for help, but no one's hearing her. And then eventually, as the plane began to come back from its bank, and it seemed like the pilot was taking control of the craft, even though it was deafening inside and it was still terrifying, people began to open up their blinders a little bit and they started to look around, and some people sitting in the vicinity of row 14, they noticed what was going on with Jennifer and they began yelling and waving for the flight attendants. But again, the sound from this window was deafening. There was just no way the attendants could hear them. And even though everyone's waving at the attendants are very preoccupied. They're dealing with the people right in front of them who are all very worried and concerned. They're trying to talk to the captain about what they need to do next. And so they did not see there was this emergency happening. And so for several more minutes, Jennifer is just stuck out the window with nobody helping her. And it was during this time, as Holly is holding on to her waist and she's holding on to the girl, that Holly is thinking, Jennifer, she's been stuck outside the plane where there's no oxygen for almost 10 minutes. Nobody can survive that. And Jennifer's been forced through this window that's not big enough to have a person fit through it. And so Holly found herself moving her left hand that was gripping onto Jennifer's waist. She just let go of it, not because she was trying to let go of Jennifer. Frankly, her hand was not keeping Jennifer from going anywhere. It was just kind of habitual that she was holding on to her waist. So she takes her hand off of her waist and she just places it right in the center of Jennifer's back. Like she was comforting Jennifer. She was showing Jennifer that you're not alone. We can't help you, but you're not alone. And the woman in row 15, an older woman, she saw Holly do this and she reached across and she put her hand on Holly's back. It was like everybody knew this is a total crisis, but there's just nothing we can do, even if it's killing Jennifer. Despite the damage to the left engine from it exploding, the captain, Tammy Jo Schultz, who was a longtime veteran of the airline, she was able to combat this hard bank to the left, and she regained control of the plane, at which point, through the intercom, she was able to bark out orders that were loud enough for the flight attendants to actually hear what was going on, and they were instructed to get up and walk down the aisles and make sure the passengers are okay. And this is when the crew spotted Jennifer. They acted quickly and rushed over and they grabbed Holly and the girl next to her, and they safely got them out of that row and moved them to a different row. And then once they were gone, two men named Andrew and Tim, they volunteered to go in row 14 and pull Jennifer back into the plane. They knew the risks. They pull her in, there is still an opening in this plane, and they could very easily just get sucked out themselves. But they didn't care. They knew they needed to help this woman. And so without any hesitation, the two men walked into row 14. They got in position, and with all their might, they were able to pull Jennifer in. They got her into the aisle, and then the two men were able to leave row 14 without being sucked out. And so Jennifer is laying in the aisle, and a passenger who happened to be a nurse, who was named Peggy, she rushed over and she began performing CPR. At this point, Holly remembers looking around the cabin and seeing that everybody was just perfectly still. It was still deafeningly loud inside of the cabin because this window is still sucking air out. So it's very, very loud, but she's looking out and there was just this aura of calm inside the plane. No one was running around. No one was panicking. Everyone was just kind of sitting, watching as Peggy was trying to save Jennifer's life. At 11:21 a.m., so 17 minutes after that pop was heard outside of the plane, the captain of this plane is able to successfully perform an emergency landing at an airport in Philadelphia. And as soon as they touched down on the runway, the captain had already coordinated with a medical team who was standing by, and they rushed on, they grabbed Jennifer, they rushed her out, they got her to the hospital, but unfortunately she didn't make it. She died from blunt force trauma from having been forced out of that window. It was just too small, and it happened too suddenly, and it killed her. Holly was obviously very shaken up by this experience, just like the rest of the passengers who were on board. But there's a detail in Holly's story that makes her experience even more traumatic. On the morning she got on this plane, she arrived at the airport fairly early. She had a big coffee with her, and she got in line for security. So as she's going through this line, she's drinking this huge coffee, and then when it's her turn to actually go through the scanners, she finishes this coffee, she throws it away, she goes through security, and by the time she's on the other side, she's now late. And so she runs all the way to her gate, and when she boards, her boarding group has already gotten on. And so all the seats that she liked to take, those are already gone. She liked to sit towards the front of the plane because she liked to be one of the people that got off the plane first once they landed. And so she began looking for the first open row that she could sit in. And so she starts walking down the row, and she finally gets to row 14. She's looking on her left, and there's a totally open row, 3 open seats. And so, like she always did on long flights, she took the window seat, seat 14A, because she could lean her head up against the side of the plane and sleep. And so after she buckled herself in and put her luggage underneath the seat in front of her, she remembered she had just drank that huge cup of coffee while she was going through security. And even though she didn't have to go to the bathroom right then, she expected to probably have to go a couple of times once they took off. And so, not wanting to disrupt the 2 people that were inevitably going to take the 2 seats next to her by constantly all flight long getting up and sneaking past them to go to the bathroom over and over again, Holly decides, you know what, I'll just move. I will sit in the aisle seat. It's not as good because I can't sleep, but at least this way I can get up and use the bathroom without disrupting the people I'm sitting near. And so she unbuckles herself, she reaches down, she grabs her bag from underneath the chair in front of her, she stands up, and she moves 2 seats over to the aisle seat of row 14. She sits down, she puts her seatbelt on, she puts her luggage under the seat in front of her there, and then as she's kind of getting herself situated, she sees someone has stopped right outside of row 14. And so she turns, and looking down at her is the smiling face of Jennifer Reardon. And she says, hi, is anybody sitting next to you? Can I sit next to you? And Holly says, absolutely. And Jennifer sneaks past her and sits in. In 1986, Annie and Jessica Andrews, who are teenage sisters, unfortunately lose their mother to cancer. It was a relatively abrupt death. It caught the family by surprise, and so following her death, Annie and Jessica lived full-time with their father, Brian Andrews. Now, Brian worked a lot, but with the death of his wife, he had to work even more to make sure he was bringing home enough of an income to provide for his 2 daughters. Annie and Jessica were hit very hard by the loss of their mother. They were very close with her, and with their father being gone so much, those 2 were left alone a lot at the house and left alone with their thoughts, and they missed their mom. And so one night when Brian was out at work, the girls decide to use a Ouija board and to try to contact their mother. And they would even admit that they didn't really expect anything to happen. They just wanted some sort of connection to their mother, who they missed terribly. So they went down in the basement, they got out the Ouija board, and they have like a seance. They didn't really do much research into how to do it or what to do. They basically just started, kind of asking if their mother was here, could she give them some sign? And they have this kind of Ouija board seance, and nothing comes of it. Brian is not home for this. Their father's not home, and it's just those 2. And after a couple of hours of doing this seance, they ultimately put it away. And in a way, it was kind of a cathartic experience that they got to, think about their mom really intently and kind of think maybe she could be with them right then. And in many ways, the seance was a success because it made them feel closer to their mom, even if it was just for a moment and if it was artificial. So they put the Ouija board away and the girls go upstairs and they're kind of having a low-key night and ultimately decide to go to bed. Now, their father has not come home yet, so just the girls. They're used to this. This is how a lot of nights went. And as they're laying in bed, they both start hearing tapping sounds. Now, they're in separate rooms and they heard the same tapping sounds. And in fact, Jessica would get up and come into Annie's room and say, hey, do you hear the tapping sound on the walls? And Annie's like, yeah, I hear it too. And they're listening and there's silence and they hear this kind of like tapping sound in the walls. They didn't know what it was. They'd never heard it before. And the girls, again, they miss their mother so terribly. And they were basically hoping that it was their mom. They knew it couldn't be, but they were hoping it was. And so they're like, it's mom. Mom's trying to get in touch with us. She's making sounds to get in touch with us. It's from the seance. It must have worked. And they start asking their mother questions like, are you here with us right now? And can you show yourself to us? And, are you looking after us? Just like questions that you would imagine people might ask if they thought, the ghost of a loved one was in the room with them. And so it was scary, but it was also kind of reassuring that you have what they believed to be the spirit of their mother looking out for them. And when their father finally came home that night, the tapping at this point had stopped, and they rushed to tell their father about the tapping they heard. And they were happy about it. They weren't scared about it. They were happy about it. And, Brian, he's worked all day, and he's grieving the loss of his wife, and he thinks that his daughters are making it up, especially because they told him about the Ouija board. And he's just thinking to himself, they're grieving. They're struggling with the loss of their mother. They're grieving. And, he felt really bad for them. And he even considered that first night putting them into therapy. Not because he was upset with them or anything, but because he's like, this is a manifestation of grief. But he ultimately said, look, guys, just go back to bed. I'm sure she's looking out for us. Go to bed. We'll talk about this tomorrow. And so the girls went back to their rooms. Brian didn't think much of it. He was just thinking, should I bring the girls to grief counseling, something like that? And everybody goes to bed. Now, this tapping would persist for several days. The tapping got so frequent that it actually started disturbing the girls' sleep. And every time they would yell to their father to come in and check, the tapping would stop. And so it was like kind of driving them crazy. And then when they would all leave the house during the day, in the evening, whenever, anytime the house was empty. And so they would come back to the house and, things would be moved, furniture would be moved slightly out of position. Some of the silverware had been moved around, just little things all over the house. And, Annie and Jessica's father is quick to say, guys, I know this is you. I know you miss your mom, and I know you want this to be real, that you want your mom to be here with us right now, but she's not. And you got to stop this whole ghost thing. You got to stop moving the furniture around. This is not healthy. If this continues, I am going to ask that you guys start seeing a grief counselor. And the girls were insistent that it was not them. And the fact that their father didn't believe them and they knew it wasn't them, it put them in a really bad spot because they felt totally alone, scared to be in their house, because now it didn't really feel like their mother. It felt like something screwing with them. And that's not something their mother would do. And so they're thinking that this is like an evil ghost that they've unlocked through that Ouija board seance. And it's now terrorizing them. And there's nothing they can do because their father doesn't believe them. And it's just consistently happening. They don't know what to do. One evening in January of 1987, the girls were together in the front room of their house. And they started hearing tapping sounds again. And so they hear this tapping sound not coming from the walls, but coming from the basement. And suddenly they feel, some confidence, like they're going to go down and confront this thing. Because their father doesn't believe them, they don't know what to do, so they're just going to go face this thing head on. So they head right downstairs into the basement, and there's nothing. The tapping stops as soon as they're down there, and they can't find anything. As they turn to go back upstairs, feeling a little bit silly that they're going to go fight this ghost, they notice writing in red that says, "Come find me, I'm in your closet," and they're horrified. Because now this is like confirmation that this thing is screwing with them. It's not their mother. And it's now interacted outside of just tapping. It's actually writing on the walls. And so the girls run out of the house because this feels like a threat. They felt threatened by everything that was happening before, but it was almost like the writing on the wall was a step over the line. This felt like a direct, intentional threat towards the girls, kind of absolutely taunting them and scaring them. So they run out of the house. Their father was not there, he was working. And so the girls ran next door to their neighbors and said, can we stay with you for a minute? Something weird's happening in our house. They began to get into the weird writing on the walls, but didn't really go into too much detail. And the neighbor said, we're just gonna wait for your father to come home before we do anything. And so the girls stay with the neighbor. Brian comes home. As soon as they see Brian pull in the driveway, they flag him down. He comes over to the neighbors. Neighbor pulls Brian aside and says, here's what happened. They came over here. The girls are hysterical, and they tell their dad that there's writing inside the house. And so Brian, his first reaction is, this is out of control now, guys. This is too much. He goes over though with them to the house, and he goes into the basement and he sees the writing on the wall, and his thought is like, now you guys are defacing our property to live out this kind of fantasy. And so this for him was the line in the sand that they've now crossed. It's now getting totally unhealthy, and he ordered them to go see grief counseling. So that actually began at this point. Several weeks would go by with no tapping, no anything, just silence in the house. It was almost like whatever this was had stopped. Then one night when Brian is working late into the night once again and the girls are alone, they're in the front room together and they're just sitting there. It's been nice having a couple weeks without any strangeness in the house, and they start hearing tapping from somewhere else in the house. And they get up, they kind of creep their way over to where they think they're hearing it, and it's coming from Annie's bedroom. When they go into Annie's bedroom, written on the walls is, "I'm back, find me if you can." Just like the last time they saw writing on the wall, they run out of the house. They flee the house, they go to the same neighbor's house, and they say, "It happened again. You gotta believe me, it happened again." The neighbor says, "Stay with me, we'll wait for your father again." Father comes home, same situation plays out. He gets flagged over to the neighbor's house. The neighbor says, "Hey, they're back again," with the writing on the wall. And Brian's mad. And he says to the girls, like, "I put you in counseling. I'm telling you to stop doing this. Like, this isn't okay. It's not healthy." And he tells the girls and the neighbor to stay here. I'm going to go in that house and I'm going to search the house top to bottom to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of in that house. And so he goes back to his own house, and when he opens the door, the house is in total disarray. It's like someone had ransacked the house. And he's thinking to himself, the girls didn't do this. Someone else did this. And so now he's on edge. And he walks through the house, he's not hearing anything, and he goes up to Annie's bedroom, and he sees the writing on the wall. And then he looks, he sees a man standing in the closet wearing women's clothes, which would turn out to be his dead wife's clothes, wearing a wig, carrying a hatchet. And this man in a dress is staring at Brian, and Brian's startled. The guy starts running out. Brian tries to grapple and fight with him, but the man in the dress manages to run past Brian out into the rest of the house. Brian is like so caught off guard because this guy's got a hatchet. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He starts chasing after him, but the guy's gone. Brian's looking in his house, but finally Brian just leaves the house because this guy's got a hatchet. He runs outside, he runs over to his neighbor's house, and he's like, "Call 911, there's somebody in the house." He makes sure his girls are okay, he stays with his neighbor, calls the police. The police go in, and they look everywhere, and they can't find anything. And they say to Brian, like, "I'm sure someone was here. It's a very convincing story you've just told, but they're not here now. And unfortunately, all we can do is tell you, you probably should not be here right now until whoever this was is caught. And you should stay with some relatives. We'll watch the house. We'll see if anybody else comes back, but there's not much we can do." And so, unfortunately, the girls and the father are left with no answer to what was going on or who this person was. And Brian's thinking to himself, like, how did he get away? How did this guy in the dress get away? Like, how did that happen? I mean, they're searching the neighborhoods. He's wearing a pretty distinctive outfit. How did he get away? And so for 2 weeks, Brian and his daughter stayed with some family. But in those 2 weeks, no one found out who this guy in the dress was. I mean, Brian and the girls are traumatized. Brian feels like this horrible father, that I've left my girls alone in the house over and over and over again with some crazy person with an axe in my house. I never believed them. What could have happened to them? It would have been my fault. And so it's a horrible time period. The girls are traumatized because now they realize they've been interacting with some crazy person in a dress with an axe in their walls. And it's just this horrible situation. But after 2 weeks, it's tough living with another family member. It's a tight place they're staying. And they decide, you know what? At this point, whoever that guy was, he must have ran away. We got police watching the house. Let's just go home. Let's just go home. We'll lock everything up. We'll get a security system. There's police watching the house. Let's just go home. And so they decide, okay, let's pack up and head home. And so as Brian is driving up his street, he looks at his house and he can see that there's a light on in the second floor. And he's thinking to himself, like, I thought the police were just watching it from the outside and just kind of patrolling the neighborhood. I didn't know there'd be police inside my house. And as he's looking up at the window, about to pull into his driveway, he sees the guy in the dress suddenly walk across the window. He sees him clear as day. So he stops what he's doing and he calls the police. Police are there in a second. The house is surrounded. So with the house surrounded, police finally go inside. Now, no one's been inside the house since Brian and the girls left. They locked it up and they were monitoring it. There was no police inside the house. There was nobody inside the house, supposedly. The police, when they open up the door and go inside, the first thing they notice is not only is all the furniture flipped upside down and moved all over the place, but there are pennies glued to the ceiling. All these pennies glued to the ceiling. And there's red writing all over the house, on all the walls and weird places, just writing, strange cryptic writing. But they search the house and they don't find anything. But one of the officers who was down in the basement at one point noticed that there was a little piece of wood covering up what looked like a crawl space behind the washer and dryer. And he found that he could very easily move aside the washer and the dryer. And there was this board that when he pulled it aside, it was the entrance to a crawl space. In the crawl space, they find that someone had kind of burrowed between all of the insulation all around the house into all the walls. And there are these little peepholes in all the different rooms that whoever was in the crawl space could look into any room at any given time. And as they're searching this intricate crawl space that spanned the whole house, they find Danny LaPlante, who was this totally deranged teenager who had briefly dated Annie. Annie had broken it off with him, and so he had snuck into their house and had been living in their walls, listening to their conversations, had heard about Annie's mother passing away, and had kind of adopted this "I'm gonna pretend to be your dead mother" routine, and had been writing in ketchup on the walls and tapping it. He had watched them do the seance, and so he had all this stuff to work with to really spook them, and had been sneaking out and moving furniture around and sneaking back into the walls for months. And that's not even the worst of it. Danny LaPlante, after he was brought out of the crawl space, was arrested and then put into a juvenile detention center. And then when he got out of the detention center, later in 1987, for reasons that no one understands, I don't even think Danny understands, he broke into someone's house and murdered almost an entire family in cold blood. On April 28, 2000, a 24-year-old named Yuri Lipsky was standing in front of a cafe in Dahab, Egypt, overlooking the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from Moscow in order to film himself swimming through the Arch. But now it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel that connects a massive sinkhole right on Dahab's shoreline called the Blue Hole to the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you need to enter the Blue Hole directly and descend straight down 181 feet, where you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which apparently it's pretty easy to do, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep does not mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The arch actually starts at 181 feet, but then goes all the way down to 393 feet. So it's a huge, huge opening. The risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing. For those who are unfamiliar with diving, generally speaking, you have two types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same air that you breathe on the surface. They literally jam air directly into scuba bottles. You breathe that and you go down to 130 feet. That's the recommended bottom depth that you would go down breathing regular air. And then there is technical diving, where you breathe a special mixture of gases. Typically it's going to be a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen that allow you to go below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training. Because the minimum depth you would need to go to in order to access the arch is 181 feet, that puts you well in the technical diving range, which means you should be diving mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and go through it on regular air. And year after year, people die doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis, which is a lot like being drunk. And in extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to remove their mouthpiece and inhale water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much faster, and regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air below 130 feet. Also, oxygen can become toxic the deeper you go in the water column. It can lead to blackouts and convulsions that if you don't have someone there to literally physically move you up in the water column, you won't recover from it and you'll die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen. So if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at an increased risk of developing O2 toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet and make it through the arch and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically at 181 feet pushing the absolute boundary of what you can get away with on regular air. Below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying very close attention to your depth as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly 200 feet and beyond. So earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the blue hole and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught inside the blue hole. His name was Tarek Omar, and he asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through the arch. And Tarek said, yes, but I need to train you for 2 weeks before you're going to be considered qualified to do that. And you need a special setup with a special gas mixture to do this dive. And Yuri was like, well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today or tomorrow even? And Tarek was like, no, that's not how this works. And Tarek understood this more than anybody else, because in addition to teaching diving at the blue hole, Tarek's job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers that attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is not an official body count of how many people have perished inside of the blue hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people just in the last decade. After Tarek was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple different other diving instructors with the same request. Will you take me in the next couple of days? And they all said, no, we need to train you and you need special equipment. And so finally, after no one was willing to do this, Yuri just left. Later that day, owners of cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the blue hole. He puts on all of his scuba gear, he puts on a helmet and then straps a big camera to the top and ratchets it down. And then after he's got all his stuff on, he jumps into the blue hole and he disappears. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow did not see him get off the flight he was supposed to be on, and they reported him missing. Tarek Omar was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. Tarek hopped in the blue hole, he went to the bottom, and sure enough, lying face down at the bottom was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they realized his camera had been running the whole time, and he had actually filmed his final moments. Yuri's final video exists online, so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating his camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit record, and then he jumped into the water. It was determined later on that Yuri was breathing regular air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and then Yuri begins to sink very quickly into the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal, and he's not thrashing around, so it seems like it's a controlled descent. But at some point, you hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. Basically, it's this life jacket, to describe it simply, that sits on your gear that you have a demand valve where you can inflate and deflate the air into it to neutralize your buoyancy. Or in an emergency situation, you can fully inflate it and stop yourself from sinking. In fact, you'll rise to the surface. But he's trying to activate his buoyancy compensator to slow down his descent, and the air is escaping his compensator. There's a leak and he can't slow down his descent. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. In fact, I don't really know of all that many dives that you wouldn't use a weight belt. And any diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. Specifically, if you're in an uncontrolled descent or if you're in an emergency situation and need to get to the surface, you can jettison your weight belt and go to the surface. But Yuri was panicking and he was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that he was desperately trying to activate, and it was failing. And so he's not going for his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. So he goes below 181 feet, he goes below 200 feet, and he goes all the way to the bottom where he hits the bottom at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide because the bottom of the blue hole was actually at an angle, and that archway went all the way to the bottom of the hole. And if you slipped out of the blue hole, it was a sheer drop off for thousands of feet. And you see on camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to definite death. And he's trying to get himself to stop, and finally he anchors himself in the dirt. And it's calm for a second, and he's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, and then it goes still. And it's believed at this point he either removed his mouthpiece because of nitrogen narcosis, he pulled it out and inhaled water, or he was dealing with O2 toxicity and he blacked out and the mouthpiece came out. But either way, he drowned. Situated an hour's drive from Johannesburg in South Africa lies Sterkfontein Cave. The cave is famous for the fossils that have been found there and also for its underground lake, whose walls look like Swiss cheese. There's all these tunnels that spider all over the place. Many of them are unexplored, and no one knows how deep the cave actually goes. In 1984, cave diver Peter Verhussel, along with two of his friends, decided they wanted to explore these passageways in the lake, and specifically they wanted to check out a chamber called Milner Hall, which was fairly far down in the lake. There was a guideline that was anchored from the surface of the lake all the way down into the different sections that had been explored, and this was so cave divers could hold on to it and make their way through without getting lost. Not that I've ever been cave diving, but from what I've read, there is one golden rule. You never let go of the guideline. And if you do, it better be extremely well planned, and you should do it with other divers present. Peter was a notorious risk taker and was the least experienced cave diver of the three. When they entered the lake, they were all holding the guideline, and Peter was the third back. And so they began descending down into the lake, and at some point, Peter's curiosity got the better of him, and he left the line to go look at the wall where there was, something he wanted to look at. And luckily, the other two divers noticed it, they saw him, and they swam over and got him and brought him back to the guideline. And even though you can't communicate underwater, I'm sure they looked at him like, come on, don't do that. And they kept going down, and then once again, Peter's curiosity gets the better of him. He leaves the guideline and goes over and checks something else out. The other two divers notice again, they turn around, they grab him, and they pull him back. And now they're looking at him like, you can't do this, no more. And so Peter's body language indicated that he got it, and he was back on the guideline, he's not gonna do it again. And they continue down, and they're getting closer to Milner Hall when the first two turn around to check on Peter, and he's gone. And now previously, when they found him those other two times when he left the guideline, he was just over right against the wall, and he was easy to spot. But this time he wasn't. They're looking around with their lights, and he's nowhere to be found. And they're not prepared to go leave into one of these tunnels to go looking for him because there were so many. It was like Swiss cheese down there with all these different tunnels he could have gone into, and they didn't know which one he went in. And so after kind of waiting and looking around for a couple of minutes, thinking maybe he'll come back, they were running out of air and they had to go to the surface. So the two men surface, they call the police, they explain what happened. Rescue divers are sent to the cave to go looking for Peter, but by the time they even got there, it had been several hours. It takes a while to mount this type of search, and Peter only had one tank of air. And so if he hasn't surfaced by now, the thought is he's drowned at this point. But the rescue divers go into the lake, they head down to the area where Peter was last seen, and they look around and they can't find him, and they surface pretty quickly, and they say, look, we're just not prepared to look through all these different tunnels he could have gone in just to find his body. Because at this point, there's no way he's alive. He's been down here for hours, he doesn't have enough air, and one of the rescue divers is gonna get trapped in one of these tunnels, and we don't want to lose anyone, so we're terminating the search. Peter's friends are devastated, and they say, hey, can you let us go down and look for Peter's body for his family? And the police said, no, we're banning diving in this cave. 6 weeks after Peter went missing inside of this lake, a group of dry cavers were doing some work in a chamber that was right next to this underground lake. And they were chiseling this wall when all of a sudden the wall kind of collapsed, revealing another chamber on the other side of this wall. They took their flashlight out and they looked inside, and it looked like a tunnel that kind of weaved around the corner. And they shined their light on the ground, and it looked like there were some muddy or sandy footprints that were left as if someone had been walking right there. The cavers were initially terrified, the idea that there's anything living behind the walls inside of a cave. But they stepped over and they walked around the corner, and it revealed this huge air pocket that clearly was connected to the underground lake, because there was water right in the middle of this air pocket and there was no other way in besides, this wall that's collapsed. And in the middle of the water, there was this island. It was like this sandy, muddy, rocky island right in the middle of this air pocket. And laying on the island was Peter. In a stroke of luck, after Peter went missing from his dive, he had discovered this air pocket and he had surfaced and climbed onto this island. He knew he didn't have enough air in his air tank to get to the surface again. And so he figured, okay, I'll just sit on this island. There seems to be enough air in here for me. I'll wait until my dive buddies invariably go get help and come down here and rescue me. He sat inside of that air pocket for 3 weeks waiting for a rescue that never arrived. Before he ultimately died of starvation, he wrote a message in the sand to his mother and to his wife, telling them that he loved them. To this day, diving is still prohibited inside of Sterkfontein Cave. A little after 1:30 in the morning on June 17th, 2017, 34 U.S. Navy sailors were asleep inside of berthing compartment number 2 on the USS Fitzgerald. Their berthing compartment was below the waterline, meaning where they were sleeping was underwater. They were sailing along through the South China Sea when all of a sudden there is this explosion in the berthing compartment and a rush of cold air. The explosion was a 30,000-ton container ship crashing into them, gouging an opening in their wall bigger than a semi-truck. Before any of the 34 sailors could make sense of what was happening, tens of thousands of gallons of seawater are pouring into their compartment. The sailors were sleeping in what they called coffin lockers, which were these bunk beds where the bunks were stacked 3 high, and the lowest bunk was practically on the ground. And so as soon as the water came pouring into the room, everybody who was sleeping on a lower bunk was immediately completely submerged in water, and all the furniture inside of the space was lifted up by the rush of water, and a few unlucky sailors who were in those bottom bunks were trapped by furniture that landed right in front of their bunk. The sailors immediately jumped into action, leaping out of their bunks, pulling people out of those lower bunks. Everybody's trying to help each other out to get to the exit, which was a ladder that led up to a hatch in the ceiling. The sailors inside of this space were very close with each other. Pretty much 24 hours a day, they were always within a few feet of each other. And so that explains why, as the water was rising and rising, getting up to their necks, they formed an orderly line as they all made their way up this ladder through this hatch. As they waited in line to get out of the space, the water was getting so high that they were tilting their heads to barely be able to breathe the space that was left inside of the room. And when the water is really cold, you involuntarily open your mouth. And so water was pouring into their mouths, making it very hard to breathe. As each man climbed the ladder and went through the hatch to relative safety, they would turn around and help the next guy up. And they remembered hearing this hissing sound, which was the sound of all the air being forced out of the compartment through this hatch as it filled with seawater. And then finally, the survivors that had made it out of the hatch were able to pull the last few guys that were in line to go up the ladder. They pulled them out, and then they realize they're short 8 sailors. But they're faced with this terrible decision because they need to shut the hatch and seal it. It's a procedure inside of a sinking ship to keep it from sinking. If they don't shut this compartment, they run the risk of killing more people on board the ship. And so they decide they're going to wait for a couple of extra seconds, and they begin yelling, "Come to the sound of my voice," in hopes that anybody that's still down there could hear them through the water and would swim to them. And then before they shut it, they poked their head down and looked, and they saw a glimmer of what looked like a man swimming away from the ladder. And they're thinking, why are they swimming away? Don't they know they need to come here? And they're yelling to this person, come back, swim to our voice. And then moments later, this burly sailor from Arizona named John Meade came out of the darkness and clambered up the ladder, and they pull him out, and he's coughing and he's gagging, and he said, "Gary Ream saved me. I was behind a locker. He pulled me out." And it dawned on the 2 sailors that saw that man swimming away from the ladder farther into the compartment that they had tried to stop, that they had tried to get back to them, that wasn't John Meade. That was Gary Ream. He was intentionally swimming back to save these guys. But now, in a cruel twist of fate, they had to seal the hatch, with Gary and 6 others still inside. At 37 years old, Gary Ream was a veteran of the ship. He referred to the other sailors as his kids, and when they were on land, he would invite them over to his house for holiday meals. He was approaching 20 years of service, and he was planning to retire soon and move back to Virginia with his family and become a fireman. Gary was asleep inside of berthing compartment number 2 when the crash happened, and instead of going up the ladder to safety, which he could have done, he was near the ladder, he instead decided to make multiple trips into the far back section of the compartment, which is where the most people were trapped by furniture, either in their bunks or in the bathroom stalls. And he went back over and over and over again, knowing full well that once this water reaches the ceiling, they are going to seal the hatch. He's been in the Navy almost 20 years. He knows the procedure. But Gary loved his kids, and he was prepared to die for them. And on this day, he did. 19 of the 27 surviving sailors credit Gary for saving their life. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please offer the like button a ride